My name is Peter Semensky. I'm the chair of the MFA in Visual Studies program. Welcome to the first of the Visual Studies lecture series for spring 2018. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a lecture by Ayana Jackson tonight. And this lecture coincides with an exhibition that will open Thursday night. If you are all around, we'd love to see you. It's an exhibition curated by Mo Dudang. Its title is New Feelings, Photography from a Diasporic Perspective, here at the Center for Contemporary Art and Culture at PNCA. So this exhibition runs from February 1st through April 14th, 2018. Please come back. There are projects by Ayana, Hassan Hajjaj, Amiri Kamudzengiriri, Rachel Monasov, Michelaine Thomas, Rodrigo Venezuela. And Motive is here tonight, as well as during the exhibition's opening on Thursday night. I'm sure he would love to talk to you as well. So I am going to hand it off to Eric Long, who's a second year MFA in Visual Studies student who will introduce the lecture tonight. Thank you all.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us here tonight for the Visual Studies Visiting Artist Lecture Series. It is a great pleasure to introduce the immensely talented Ayana V. Jackson. Jackson's work, both performative and photographic, is centered around contemporary African and African American diasporic societies. Utilizing the portrait, she questions how Black identities and gender stereotypes have been constructed and consumed through the lens of photography throughout history, specifically the 19th and early 20th centuries. Her works, both beautiful and haunting, seem to surpass time itself, existing in the past and present. Of course, the artist said it best that her portraits work as a way, quote, to shift something in the past to get right with the present in order to have a better future, end quote. Born in the US, Jackson now splits her time between Johannesburg, New York, and Paris. She has been part of a plethora of group and solo exhibitions, showing yearly since 2004. Jackson has exhibited at Galerie Boudouin Le Bon in Paris, Gallery Momo, Cape Town, Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, the the Studio Museum in Harlem, pardon me, Gallery Show Contemporary, Tokyo, and the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporic Art, Brooklyn, as well as many, many more across the world. She has been featured in numerous publications and has been awarded the National Black Arts Festival Visual Arts Award and the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship for Photography. Her work is now on view as part of New Feelings here at the Center for Contemporary Art and Culture at PNCA, curated by Mo Dudang, opening this Thursday through April 14th. Please join me in welcoming the incredibly powerful Ayana V. Jackson.
Thank you, Eric, for such a wonderful introduction. That was great. Thank you guys all for coming out. I'm just going to let this, the slideshow is just going to kind of go on its own, and I will kind of speak to it randomly. Actually, I'm going to break the format a little bit if you guys don't mind, and feel free to not want to play along. But I thought it might be fun to start with Q&A. We can do a second Q&A, but if anyone in the room already has a question, I thought it might be fun because it would be really great for me to kind of get a sense of what you'd like to get out of this talk and kind of frame how I speak. So if there are any questions, we can start there. Nobody wants to play with me? Okay, let me just grab my notes then. All right, so as was stated, I am originally from the United States. I was born in New Jersey. I studied at Spelman College. Actually, I'm kind of jealous of you guys because I actually didn't get a chance to get my MFA. I actually received my bachelor's in sociology in '99 at Spelman College, an historically black women's college in Atlanta. My father was a super fan of photography and taught me when I was growing up. So, I kind of don't remember a time before photography in my life. So it's always been one of those media that I always wanted to speak through. I later did some kind of ad hoc classes, auditing, if you will, at the University of Art in Berlin, where I studied under the amazing photographer Katharina Sieverding, who came out of the Dusseldorf School and studied under Yusuf Boyz. And I mentioned her, and I was actually telling Jess, the student that I did a studio visit with earlier, that it was an incredible program because Katharina felt that education, arts education, shouldn't be limited just to students who could afford to enroll. So she actually had 2/3 of her class were random people her TAs pulled off of the gallery circuit in Berlin and just threw us in class. She got into quite a bit of trouble for that, but I managed to get 3 semesters out of photography theory, and I also got to work in her lab. So that's probably the limits of my formal education in fine art and photography. I later moved to Johannesburg over 2 different stints. I first lived there in 2001 and then went back in 2007. And it was there that I began to move out of the documentary reportage work that I had been doing previously and into fine art. The very first series that I exhibited with Gallery Momo in Johannesburg was the series that we're looking at right now. It's called Leapfrog, A Bit of the Other, Grand Matron Army. To give you a little bit of background about what my work seeks to do, I'll start with this series. When I was later, actually, I bounce a bit in time, when I was, after Berlin, I went to Paris, and or actually, no, first Johannesburg, and then from Johannesburg, I was curated into an exhibition in Mali, where I was later given a residency in Paris at Cité des Arts. And while I was there, I was given a studio for the first time in my life. All of my projects previous to then had been more kind of going out into the world and taking photographs. I worked a lot with Afro-Latinidad, Afro-Mexicans, Afro-Venezolanos, and the like, a lot of portraiture work. But I was awarded this residency, and I was faced with 4 white walls for the first time, not knowing what to do. And thus began how my process has always gone. I'm thrust into a situation that makes me uncomfortable, and then I try to find a way to find a solution to that dis-ease through the camera. And I'll just tell a quick anecdote about this series. I can pause it here just for 1 second. There's an artist, Fred Wilson, who's one of my major inspirations. He represented the United States in the Venice Biennale. He's the first black man, if I remember correctly, a black American artist to represent the United States in the Biennale. And he had an exhibition in Paris, in this amazing gallery where everyone in the gallery were like dripping in diamonds and just reeking of money. And I guess it kind of goes without saying that it was predominantly a white space and a very wealthy space. And I'm just going to go back a bit so that I can segue and time myself as well. And I remember this feeling very much outside of the room and kind of strange in my skin in that space. I was new to Paris and I wasn't speaking very much French at the time. And Fred eventually comes over to me and he's like, "Thank you so much for coming, because if you hadn't come, I would be the only black person here." And that's really strange considering my work. He was showing at that time his globes with black crystals illustrating the slave trade and the crown of the Queen's crown in black crystals, and had really like heavy commentary on diaspora, but there were no people of color in the room. And I said, "It's cool, no problem. I've got more people coming, I've got you." But it was very strange because even when other people came, it felt like I felt very much kind of suspicious or conspicuous in that space. Until later he invited me to the dinner, where I went up. He says, "Okay, well, thanks for bringing all your friends, but I can only bring you to the dinner." I was like, "Okay, fine." Everybody understands how this art world works. So after this, my posse left, and I went on to the dinner, and suddenly I went from completely invisible to hyper visible just by virtue of having been invited into this space. And in that moment, I was in this I felt like I was this odd, like, anthropological figure suddenly. Everyone wanted to know who I was, where I was from. I guess I must have been speaking Spanish to someone, why I spoke Spanish. And there was this kind of thing of every conversation was like I was a subject of some kind of anthropological, inquiry. And I remember, questions like, is this your first time traveling? And, like, have you been on a plane before? I mean, it was like almost that bad, you know what I mean? And, France, as if anyone just heard about the response to Chimamanda's book in Paris recently, France has got some road to cover when it comes to dealing with its Black population. But, and I remember thinking to myself, I really wish that I could enter these rooms, these all-white spaces, multiply myself into every Black iconic woman, and let us all introduce ourselves to everyone in the room, and then snap back to myself and talk about the weather or the art like everybody else. And that is how this series began, and it's also how I began to work with my own body. So that would have been around 2011. Moving on, I guess I'll just kind of move on to how so in that moment I wanted to think about how photography and the history of photography can be implicated in the construction of racial stereotype. I'm not going to necessarily go chronologically as far as the images are concerned, but if you have questions, you can ask me about them specifically later. What I began to think about was what is the text that's written on the Black body or on the other body, on the non-white body, on the woman's body. When you see a Black body, like what exactly springs to mind, and more importantly, what doesn't spring to mind. I might end up going chronologically. The next series that I did speaks to that. It's called Maria de Latte, Matron Saint to Nannies and Wet Nurses. And that's coming up on the next slide. And at the time, I did a series called The Black Madonna. And in that series, which is not photographed here, I performed as a Black celebrity who was adopting white children. It was in response to that kind of Angelina Jolie moment of all these kind of these Black babies as accessories, or these other babies as accessories. And I remember showing one of those works to a colleague of mine, and he said, "Yeah, you just look like the nanny." And it's like, I was shocked as a Black person, it was like a Black person who said that to me. And so, again, I started to think through that. And so Maria de Latte came up because I wanted to think through elevating the nanny from disposable to divine, and to think about, again, if you can, to ask the audience to stretch their imagination to see these bodies in a different way, and to give another, to add text to the subtext of what we see when we look at each other. That led me to the next series that I began to work with, which was Poverty, Pornography, and later Archival Impulse. In this case, I began to think through the way that how photography as a medium is kind of implicated in how what we get to see, how we're taught to see, what we get to see and how we're taught to see. And I was curious about, I'd seen this film that I'm sure you guys know, Slumdog Millionaire. And in Slumdog, I heard in a review of it, it was described as poverty pornography. And that title stuck with me, and so I began to think through, it really did encapsulate what my dis-ease when it came to this kind of rampant imagery of death, disaster, disease, and destruction when it came to the Black body. Beginning with, as the previous slide, in my lifetime, being able to see the postcards of the lynching postcards, and what is this kind of desire to consume that kind of imagery. And so I wanted to, and this is mixed between archival impulse and poverty pornography because I showed them together. But in poverty pornography specifically, I was looking at more contemporary imagery, whereas this one is archival impulse. More contemporary imagery and thinking about like how journalism, for instance, was affecting the imaginary when it came to, again, the black body, the African body, the guerrilla soldier that that is kind of splashed across all of the newspapers, yet we don't know which war, which country, do we even care to know? When one thinks about, and it's obviously, we don't have to go much further than our current news cycle. When one thinks about Africa, what kinds of imagery comes to mind? Do we get a balanced view, or do we continue to think of it in terms of being war-torn, again, death, disaster, destruction, shitty? And the like. And so I wanted to use nudity in this series to think through the seductive element of it, in that we have perhaps a seductive, a seduction-repulsion relationship to this kind of imagery. We want to see, but we feel we should look away in a very kind of Judeo-Christian sense of I want to see, but I should not see. And there's something very powerful about that kind of relationship to imagery. And so it makes me wonder, why, how is it that this becomes like the money shot as opposed to, schoolgirls learning, or your middle class, which exists in all of the countries, all the 55 now countries on the continent. What is this kind of, desire to only look at the other body through a specific lens? And then that, with archival impulse, which I actually did, even though archival impulse images are chronologically prior to poverty pornography, I did these later, and I began to think through where the history of photography, where the medium of photography intersects with the black body, and that is when I began to think through the fact that you have this technology called photography emerging in the mid-19th century, which is essentially right smack in the middle of the colonial experiment. So what kind of imagery was being used to justify this civilizing mission? What kind of portrayal of these bodies went towards convincing missionaries and later whole communities to allow for the kind of rape and pillage that was happening in the colonies. And I speak specifically to the African descendant body, but as I was talking with Diego earlier, one of your MFA students, this is a narrative that is across the continents and across the colonial experiment. I felt that it was important for us to deconstruct some of this kind of imagery and then some of these narratives as a way of getting a certain amount of literacy towards how we're being deceived through imagery, how these are ultimately propaganda. Many of these images, while considered to be documents, are also elements of propaganda. And photography has always had this kind of muddled up relationship with propaganda, and I think that as we continue to consume images more and more, it's important to begin to become more literate in terms of what kind of image, what is being communicated through the imagery. Why is bare-breastedness associated with hypersexuality? Is that a Judeo-Christian value, or could it be that bare-breastedness bears no sexual indicator if you're actually living in a rural part of the Gulf of Guinea? And so for me, my exploration of that was important for me because as a person who inhabits a black woman's body, I'm affected by how the world sees me. When I stepped into that gallery for Fred Wilson's exhibition and felt othered, the reason I felt othered is because there is a subtext to my blackness, there is a subtext to my womanness, just as there is, once I open my mouth, a subtext to my US Americanness, or my North Americanness, or Middle Americanness, if we're going to be geographic about it. And so later in the Archival Impulse series, I started to think through other imagery that was happening at the same time. This, for instance, is my alma mater. Spelman College was created for colored girls by Christian missionaries. It was named for Laura Spelman. Laura Spelman Rockefeller, and so to educate young women of color. It was founded in 1881. And so I suddenly just started to think about the fact that at the exact same time, and I'll get back to this, at the exact same time that these kinds of ethnographic kind of imagery and all the stuff that came along with the World's Fair at the turn of the century and the human zoos and Otabenga and all of that, you also had this imagery at the exact same time. So what is happening in terms of how, the difference between the portrayal of the other and one's own portrayal of self? So this is something that, again, became part of my questioning around how the history of photography is implicated in construction of race and gender stereotypes. I'll take a second to talk a bit about my process here, because the next series of slides are going to kind of go through an extension of the last image, which is also in the exhibition, that is taken from the imagery from my alma mater. This next series kind of speaks to the same subject matter. So essentially, I photograph myself. I work with a Canon 5D Mark II currently. In the very, very beginning, back in when I did the Leapfrog series, the first set of images that I showed, I did work with another photographer to do those. But I later started to photograph myself. So using the remote live view function for the photographers in the room, I was able to set my camera up on a timer and watch myself and kind of play in the mirror and take the images one after the other. I use that camera as opposed to other cameras primarily because of the size format. But what happens ultimately, particularly with this series, is I end up taking away much of the resolution, much of the sharpness. I take away as like all of the things that you kind of look for in like these kind of cameras, and then build it back in to give to kind of bring in a painterliness to the work, because memory is important to me. I think that the aesthetics of memory are very interesting, and so when you see as I'm trying to ask you to reframe the past in order to affect our present, I want to access those things that make us feel as if we already knew, as if we all grew up with these portraits, as if we always knew that these urban women during the Victorian era existed. You may have remembered that I opened with a portrait of a gentleman and a woman. Those are my great-grandparents, and I grew up with that photograph in our living room, and it's another thing that I keep turning back to, because again, as I'm interacting as a young child of the 80s with magazines like National Geographic and the $1 a Day Save the Children Sally Struthers commercials that you guys may not know anything about, but this kind of really devastated portrayal of the black body and the African body. I was struggling to understand my own identity in relationship to that, because at the time we had just moved from calling ourselves, I guess, and our grandparents called themselves colored and Negro, and then my father's generation called themselves black, and then my generation was beginning to call ourselves African American. So what did Africa mean when Africa is nothing but a bunch of pot-bellied children, in terms of what I'm being? So how am I kind of struggling with my blackness through that kind of imagery? When at the same time, in my home, and in pretty much the home, granted, I did come up in a middle-class context, but even beyond that, in most homes, you did come across images, portraits from of elders, of ancestors. And so again, what is the difference between us portraying ourselves and us being portrayed? So that has been where my work has been centered around quite a bit lately. really trying to implant new memories so that we can kind of come to a more balanced state when it comes to what we see when we look at each other. This series is titled To Kill or Allowed to Live, and just incidentally, as I noticed up here, it was a series that I did in response to the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening back in 2016. In that series, it was kind of thinking through, how for generations and for centuries we've been having to kind of dodge the bullet of justice. The notion of sovereignty, a sovereign country has to do with deciding who gets to how the kind of necropolitics of things, who gets to stay alive, how is the criminal justice system organized and implemented, and what does it mean when you have a whole population of your society that is literally dodging the bullet of justice. And so to go back to one of the earlier images of the lynchings that I worked with, this is something that stayed with me because there's this kind of public lynching of Black bodies is something that we've been dealing with historically in this country since obviously the beginning, but also in terms of the Reconstruction era and this reaction to newfound freedoms within the Black community, and I find it incredibly distressing that we're continuing to deal with that. Hopefully this is going to keep going because when I stop it doesn't start again. And then moving on, so the two works, in addition to, there are three works in the exhibition, New Feelings. Two of them come from a series titled Dear Sarah. In Dear Sarah, again, it's another note. It's kind of a little side note in my study of Black Victorians. And by Black Victorians, I just simply mean, Black people who were functioning in during the Victorian era. Thinking about the bodies as contemporary and as changing. I think another problematic aspect of how that we've had a contentious relationship with representation in general, photography in particular, is that it's also this very static view of never changing, this kind of, again, stereotype, this kind of disallowance of the Black body or the other body to be contemporary, or the African body to be contemporary, for it not to move in terms of its representation, its visual aesthetic, its fashion from urban to rural, for it not be allowed, for it to constantly be represented as colonized or as enslaved or as under duress or as impoverished, and not allowed to be considered in a state of fancy, of movement, of dreaming. I always like to say that even though, we absolutely, those of us who come from, are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, that doesn't disallow us from those intimate moments, those moments that were happening, when one's not in labor. And I think that it's important for us to begin to also populate our thoughts around those other possibilities as a way of presenting and thinking of ourselves historically and currently as whole. This series is about, brings us back to England. It's a woman named Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who was captured in intertribal warfare between the Dahomey Kingdom and the Yoruba Kingdom in West Africa. And as many of you may know, the women's movement in the suffragette movement and the women's movement in England was quite instrumental in the abolition of slavery. There were rampant, I guess let me go back, because there were rampant, protests to ask England to end enslavement. And this young woman was captured and sent to be sacrificed during a ceremony where one of Queen Victoria's generals, General Forbes, was present. And he was present in order to implore the Dahomey king at the time to end, to stop actually giving these, his bounty to traders. Because, I guess, I felt that, I think it was, I think it's kind of seemed to be a very kind of philanthropic moment by Queen Victoria, but honestly, I think it's a matter of competition. Like, if I have to stop this, we have to stop the supply chain as well. So I think that it was a combination of, just like the end of slavery, it was both economic as well as a kind of moral imperative. Anyways, so just to give the story, for the sake of giving context to this exhibition, I'm just going to pause on this one for a second. General Forbes, of course, says, there's no way that I'm going to sit here and watch you, kill this young child. She was 6 at the time, supposedly. And so he says, and to the king at the time, he says, well, fine, I'll give her to you as a gift from and it's quoted to have said, the king of the blacks to the queen of the whites. So he took her and did the voyage on a ship called Bonetta. General Forbes carried her name was Ayana, on the ship called Bonetta, brought her before Queen Victoria and presented her as this gift, as was his mandate, royal to royal. And she accepted her, was impressed with her English, which she had learned on the trip, and brought her into the kingdom as her goddaughter. She wasn't raised in the court, but she was raised under the financing of the queen. Later, as it may be known to you, Queen Victoria was one of the first and most photographed queens. And so, in that she had a huge love of photography. She also had this portrait taken on her wedding day. She was given an allowance for clothing and for dresses and the like. And so this particular photograph was taken on her wedding day to a man that Queen Victoria had arranged, another Nigerian man who she had arranged. This photograph is currently in the National Portrait Gallery in London. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's very tiny. It's made by a French photographer. So in the Dear Sarah series, I wanted to, think about her as this inanimate object, given as a gift from one king to a queen. The only imagery we have of her is in a static way on her wedding day. There's maybe 2 other photographs of her, and there's no kind of there's no other way of seeing her. So I wanted to again animate her. I wanted to see her. I wanted to imagine her interior world. So I photograph her with her eyes closed towards her interior self, towards this era of dreaming. I tried to have her dancing and playing and thinking. And again, this kind of came out of the moment that I was making these works, which was around 2016. With what was going on, as was mentioned, I'm between Johannesburg and New York and Paris. So we have like the violence against the Muslim body in Paris. You have the violence against the student protests in South Africa. You have the Black Lives Matter movement, erupting all over the United States. I remember feeling that I couldn't even look at Facebook or social media because I had this sense of being petrified. Like I felt stuck. And I guess one of the consequences of the kind of work that I do, and that I am mining through all of these kind of difficult histories, it's hard for me to feel. I often feel powerless, and so I wanted to kind of honor her by giving her movement, and in this case also the one image where she's in royal blue as a reminder that she was the daughter of a Yoruba king and queen, so she was royal twice. And not to forget that it wasn't her intersection with Queen Victoria that made her royal so much as it was her birthright. So again, to come back to it, my process is very much around trying to populate new images and create new memories. Costuming is really important to me. In my process, I tend to work with a costumier, and I do a lot of my shooting in Paris, where I'm able to get access to lots of really incredible early 19th century referenced garments that were mostly made in the 20th century. So I'm renting them for periods of time to be able to play in them. The video that you saw in the beginning came out of the process of being like dressed in all these corsets and bustles and the like. And so just kind of a moment on that. So this series that's coming up now, and I'm coming to the end here of my little speech, which I did end up doing it English by English, looks like so far. The series that I'm working that I just completed, but it's an ongoing kind of, I just completed, I would say. It's pretty much rounded out. It's called Intimate Justice. I guess there is one thing that I'm going to end up doing, hopefully, around this subject. But, as you noticed earlier, I started around 2017 or so, I started to work with paintings. And the Victorians many of them were based on paintings. When I came to do Intimate Justice in the Stolen Moment, which is the current exhibition that's kind of moving around at the moment, I came across this. Do any of you guys know the story of J. Marion Sims? He's known to be the godfather of gynecology. So he has this very controversial, statue in Central Park that is now being moved to his gravesite. And I'm like, so we've gone from monument to memorial. I'm not quite sure that's progress, but I guess all right. Bless you. So for those New Yorkers, anyways, J. Marion Sims was a surgeon who from South Carolina who pretty much had got run out of a few towns. Eventually wound up on a plantation in Alabama, I want to say, and to address an issue called fistula. And fistula is, especially during this time, it was quite, and I guess it happens in general that in childbirth, particularly as they were breeding enslaved girls very early to be at the point of their first menstrual cycle to ensure that they could breed. There's often a situation of a tear between the vaginal walls and the anus that basically has feces leak through the vagina. And it was not necessarily lethal, it did create a lot of infections, but ultimately there was a need to address it. And J. Marion Sims operated over 100 times on many women, some women as many as 30 times, unanesthetized. And so out of that research came the specula. So women know the kind of duckbill that we deal with when we go through gynecological exams. Well, at the time, he came up with another shape that allowed the possibility to look in, and so he was able to actually find a way to cure this. But the monuments are to him and not to women. There are 3 women in particular, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and I think it's Anarcha that he operated on over 30 times. He went on to then, found the first women's hospital in New York, Department of Gynecology, and went on to basically revolutionize, women's medicine, and for which we are very grateful. But of course, by the time he got to New York, he figured he would anesthetize. So again, there was this idea, once again, coming back to the idea, the myths around the bodies, the notion of the Black woman's body as having a higher tolerance for pain and things like that, would justify the idea, because as beasts of burden in the slave trade, it justified the idea not to anesthetize them, even though that was possible. So anyways, I don't worry, it's not going to get all graphic, but I mentioned that because I'm thinking a lot about, and now that it's kind of in the moment that we're seeing so the things movement with that. But anyway, so I've done a series of works that I'm trying to think through to memorialize them. These aren't particularly there, so I guess you won't look for clues. But I guess what was happening in this series, Intimate Justice, is I wanted to really to go further into the representation of particularly the Black woman's body, do justice to her body, to see her in repose, to see her in beauty, to see her in another light. And what's interesting about this one is, obviously you may know the portion on the left, this was an incredibly polemical, controversial painting, because the artist rendered a Black woman in the same style that she was rendering, aristocrats at the time, French aristocracy at the time, and to present her with softness and to present her in beauty was largely controversial at the time. And then again, so my question is why? So for me, in the latter part of my my work, I've been really interested in kind of transforming the imagery. So of course you have on the left kind of a whipped back, but then to take the pose and to present it in another way. Again, I'm very interested in seeing our bodies in another way, with lightness, with movement, with grace. And I guess I'll end with, a lot of this work for me is ultimately therapy. When asked about my audience, I'll often say that I'm my audience for the work, because, to grow up in the United, is that Justin Young? No. Sorry, never mind. Sorry, it's just I don't recognize first. To grow. Sorry, it was just I can't really see, and it was just it was like class for the past. It's like, sorry, I'm losing my filter with age. Anyways, as I'm trying to really kind of get right with myself, it's really something that I was raised with a lot of pride. I definitely come from a Black nationalist family. I come from a Black is beautiful kind of framework. My great grandparents were Garveyites. So there's this kind of I've never really had an issue with my Blackness so much as I've had an issue with the representation of my Blackness and the fact that I felt myself constantly boxing stereotypes. And as I began to think through photography, coming up across people like, regarding the pain of Susan Sontag, regarding the pain of others, reading through photography theory and how photography really is again a tool of propaganda. Then I began to get a bit of relief as to the idea of okay, it's not that these are the only images that are related to these bodies. That this is the purview. This is the editing. This is a result of editing, and that there is something that I can do to kind of address that, so that I can also see myself reflected differently, and hopefully, in terms of dealing with society in general, help to heal what's happening, because the work is really not about creating greater divisions by addressing this kind of imagery, the violence of this kind of imagery, particularly the imagery that is tied up with the colonial experiment, but to also kind of educate ourselves together towards a certain amount of literacy that will allow us to kind of really be critical about images when we come across them, and to know implicitly that there are other narratives at play. Cool. So that was that. I guess I'll let it do its thing again, and then we can, I guess if there's Q&A. All right, y'all, this is your second chance to do Q&A. I mean, don't leave me hanging.
I was really interested in your use of multiplying your own body instead of bringing other bodies in. Can you talk a little bit about your use of self-portraiture and the multiplication of yourself?
Yeah, well, that, I guess, okay, so you know the story of Fred Wilson, so that's the story of how I first started dealing with like multiple, in that case, Black woman archetypes. But when I started to do archival impulse and poverty pornography, more so archival impulse. So when I began to look at these 19th century photographs coming from like the Duncan Cronin collection, all these kind of colonial stuff, again coming from the World's Fair and all of this, I wanted to, just like I was using the nudity in poverty pornography as a way of, as a metaphor for violence, you know, again, seduction and repulsion, I felt like that was enough. At least I was satisfied enough with that intervention, and for it not to be too mimetic, right? But when it came to the ethnographic photographs, it occurred to me to use other people, but then I felt like there would be no intervention, because I would then, if I were to use other women's bodies, I would basically subject other women to the same gaze. So there's no, in terms of asking my subject to think through what we're looking at, what's being communicated through these images, keeping it stagnant. First of all, only putting my body at risk politically was important, at risk of the gaze, because, you know, it's a hypothesis, you never know what's going to happen, you know, in terms of how people read it. But then also it was a way of trying to maintain a certain amount of consistency to ask the audience, what if the constant is this body, then what else am I trying to say? But mainly it was not to subject other women to the violence of that gaze. Okay, there were two others somewhere over here.
I noticed that a lot of times your images, even when they're kind of a reference to a historical image that you use, have no like discernible like background or location to them. So I wonder if you're going to speak more about how you use.
Yeah, each series kind of, well, I guess in some cases I'm more deliberate about that than others. For instance, with the white backgrounds and the black backgrounds, I guess I'm attracted to a limited palette. With Dear Sarah, the series that's in New Feelings, I was thinking of the aesthetics of like, his name is escaping me, Barclay Hendricks, a painter that you guys may know. And so, you know, so I'm attracted to the limited palette. The one, you know, series where I was quite deliberate with that, with the background, was this series. With this one, this is the first of the Poverty, Pornography, and Archival Impulse series that I did. And in this one, I was very much inspired by Gilbert and George and how they dealt with those sacred and the profane, right? So I was looking at the way that they used solarizing. I was looking at the way that they used mirroring. I was looking at the way that they used feces and penises and things like that. And so, and how, like, there was something very, there was something very, like, I wanted to use their language because I respected, you know, kind of what they've done in terms of dealing with the you know, the body, the male body, the gay body, like, you know, and that time. So in a way, I think I wanted to kind of throw a nod towards them. So that kind of got me in the space of using certain aspects of their gestures. So that's what's happening there. But as I began to think through what I wanted to bring to the background, in images like this one and this one, it was less about the Gilbert and George reference and more around thinking about mise en scène and the fact that when we look at an ethnographic image like this, it's a staged image. Like we're taught to engage with these as documents, you know what I mean, as historical objects, as documentation. But we forget that, you know, at the time, the amount of staging that was necessary. First of all, there's nothing, you know, just like, oh, just chilling about this image, right? You know, But like if you're looking at this in 1901 or so when it was made, you're not really thinking about, oh, what an interesting, staging. The photographer had such great, whatever. It's really like, oh my God, they're new. You know what I mean? They're savages. They look like demons, like whatever. Because again, this particular one was taken, in Paris for the World's Fair, and it's a group of Zulu. It's called Young Zulu Boys. Is the name of the photograph. And then all of the context of the guy standing and this and the other. So I wanted to also think about the fact that this is a theater. These images are theatrical ultimately. And so again, when we talk about the impact of or the collision of the colonial experiment and the new technology called photography, we have to also remember that there's an editing process there. There is a staging process there. There is a fiction there, and so I wanted the characters to be evidently or obviously out of context. Anybody else? There was another one in here somewhere, I know.
Could you speak about leapfrog a little bit more? What was the sort of notion for that pose and that posture and the
Leapfrog, a bit of, okay, so I'll begin with this image of Katie Clark and Ellison Jackson. So as I mentioned, the original story, Katie became a really important figure for me. My grandfather was a Freemason, and my grandmother was an Eastern Star, the Prince Hall Masons. So for those of you who know anything about this kind of stuff, basically, obviously the Masonic lodges weren't allowing non-whites into them, but eventually there was the allowance of a person named Prince Hall into the society, and he was given the capacity to start his own lodge. A lot of the Masonic lodges became a part of the Black community because many of them were safe houses. As you know, the Underground Railroad was a series of safe houses. It was no actual railroad, but it was a series of safe houses, and it was a map of safe houses. And there were a few white Masonic lodges that would take people in the journey from the south to the north. So a lot of people in the Black American community, particularly in the Northeast, come through this kind of Freemasonry or whatever. And so I wanted to think about, that speaks to the title, Leapfrog, a bit of the other, Grand Matron Army. Do you have a Grand Master and you have a Grand Matron? And the Grand Matron of the Eastern Star. So I was taking that was a picture of my great-grandmother, who I'm not certain was, I know my father's mother was an Eastern Star, my father's father was a Mason. So I was thinking about organized society as well. So, and again, when I look at, so I'm a fourth generation college graduate. So my father, my grandfather, and they went to college. They went to normal schools. And the way that was possible was largely because there were a lot of kind of social organizations that were passing information along so that you can figure out how to get your kids educated, where to go, figuring out things like a place like Spelman exists, which as I mentioned was founded in 1881. So during, in the first decades out of enslavement, there was a lot of kind of information sharing that was allowing for progress within the Black community. And I wanted to think about organized society. So it has three titles, Leapfrog, a bit of the other, Grand Matron Army. So they're arranged in this way because I think about these Black women archetypes through time as an army of women. Leapfrog itself, the title came from when I sat down to do the work. As I mentioned, I wanted to kind of create this moment where I could get rid of this kind of discomfort in all white space by wishing I could multiply myself into all of these archetypes and then snap back into one and be seen as a complex individual. and so my initial idea was to make a video. You may know two photographers, Etienne Jules Murray or Edward Muybridge. Muybridge was the one that tried to figure out if a horse could get all 4 hoofs off the floor, so it's like stop motion, really, really early stop motion photography. So I wanted to make a video of 2 women playing leapfrog, one generation gathering strength over the back of the next. Ultimately, as things go, as it always goes with my projects, I start in one place and end somewhere else. So I did do the process with another woman of having that motion. It didn't quite work out, but in the meantime, I photographed each of the characters and later myself, well, her and me, but then later I just used myself in the position of the frog. Frogs, I kept the title even though I took away the actual game that was being played, but because also it was thinking about how women, first of all, frogs are a fertility object in a lot of societies, so you have women, like black women, women all over the place, and so I know that I speak specifically to black female identity, but obviously it's quite possible to abstract from that into other communities where you find yourself able to enter. But again, I'm speaking from the perspective of black womanhood, which is that, and in that period, we gave birth to all of that labor, right? And also, then I was thinking about the position as a kinetic pose. One which gets to the middle title, a bit of the other, often because of hyper fear and anxiety towards the black male body, it was more often than not that the black woman's body would be the first body to enter new spaces. So whether it was into the home, or if it's in the case of like a Josephine Baker or Lena Horne, into the dance hall, or in the case of the first cases of loving versus whoever, first cases of intermarriage. It was usually the black woman, the black woman that was easier to kind of find their way into spaces, and more often than not, we would like leave the door open for our brothers and sisters. So I was also thinking about like the frog being able to see over barriers in that leap. To see what's in the house, to see what's over the fence, to see what's possible, and then through our birthing process, but also through our marriages and our being sisters and wives, helping to bring our men through. Meanwhile, you have a bit of the other, which came from Stuart Hall, talking about the desire of the black woman's body. So again, from plantation rape all the way through to interracial marriages, all the way through to, examples like Josephine Baker, the desire, the black woman's body as an erotic body, as an object of desire, was also something that created a certain kind of possibility, however we think, whatever judgment we decide to place on it or not, it created possibilities. The fact that, I remember I was talking to a friend of mine from Martinique, from Guadeloupe, and he was saying that when he came to the United States, it was incredible when he came to Paris, he was saying that it was like, one of the things that was most hurtful was that they all came together, they were all around the same age, they were all given the same education, but it was his sisters that got invited to the parties, it was his sisters that the teachers wanted to give an extra opportunity, and as a black male in Paris, he felt completely like undesired, and a lot of it he felt had to do with this kind of, the woman's body is less threatening, but also as an object of desire. So I felt that like in the series that all of that kind of came together for me as I thought through it, so it ended up with the 3 titles. I couldn't choose one. For me, Leapfrog, a bit of the other, Grand Matron Army, all of that is kind of in this kind of journey of black womanhood from the indigenous through to the Afropolitan. Any other questions? Yeah? Oh.
Is there somebody else?
No.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm interested in how so many of your images are like really ghostly. And like, I guess there's a relationship to like photography and like as this sort of token of the past or whatever. But I'm interested in how you see this sort of like ghostliness or subtlety or like phantasmic essence to your photographs, or if you see it at all. Maybe it's just me.
I don't know that I can say that I see it, but I can say that, again, I'm dealing with memory, and the aesthetics of memory, or, the idea that memories have aesthetics, you know what I mean? And, again, photography being one of those media that dates itself. Right? I mean, as it advances, from black and white, from the daguerreotype to, the alt to the, all these different kinds of processes through to where we are now, so it has this capacity to date itself. And so, again, when I'm looking through old family albums, I know whether I'm looking at an ancestor or if I'm looking at, a colleague. And so, yeah, I don't know that I necessarily thought of it as ghostly, but I mean, it is definitely, again, about the past, and trying to address the past in order to get better, to get right with the future, or with the present, and therefore have a better future, you know what I mean? So it's kind of, it's really about doing some of that background work, kind of back to the future. God, you guys are young. Well, you've seen Back to the Future. But I mean, if you allow me to, you haven't, you'll see it. But like the kind of Back to the Future kind of stuff, like, is it possible to kind of, go switch something in the past in order to address the present? So yeah, that's how I would say it. And again, so, I definitely am using, like I said, when I take the work out of the, once I convert the raw file, I immediately begin taking absolutely everything away, and building it back in to give it a new feeling of being dated, to kind of trick you into thinking that you already knew these people were here. Yeah? Well, I guess I'll, you know what I can do? I'll leave you. No, I'm leaving you. But I'll just put the video back on, and I'll speak about it a little bit. Can you hear me over it? This one, it's from the Intimate Justice series. The last ones where the jumping and the movement are happening. Or rather, I shouldn't say it's from the same series so much as it was presented in the same exhibition. But this is called Compared to What? And I don't work in video very often, but I enjoy working in it because sometimes when it feels appropriate. And here, I was thinking about all the costuming that I was doing and how ironic it was. I was saying to my friend Dorothy earlier, like, how ironic it was that I was putting an ass on myself as a black woman. It's like, this is kind of interesting, you know what I mean? Like, not that I subject to the idea of the black woman with a big behind, but as I'm dealing with stereotypes, it wasn't lost on me that I'm adding this kind of thing. And I was thinking a lot about that form, right? So you guys are familiar with Archie Barkman, who's known as the Venus Hottentot. So I thought it was also interesting that there's a very strange moment between her arrival in France and the change of the silhouette of the dress. And it's still kind of not known whether the addition of the bustle was a direct kind of result of her presence on the carnival circuit in France and England. But either way, it's a funny song. But either way, I thought that was something worth thinking about, and how there is this again with the woman's body and the Black woman's body in particular. There's this kind of remote proximity. There's this kind of disgust and desire at the same time, and that we have this kind of, I don't know if cognitive dissonance is the right terminology for it, but we have this kind of, as a society, we have a very strenuous relationship with the Black woman's body as an object of desire, but also as an object of rejection. So I wanted to kind of, again, think through and play with that a bit in a playful way, and also think about her as a woman who had children, who married twice, who ultimately did die as trying to make her way in England, but who wasn't in a perpetual state in this naked form with her behind hanging out. It was a performance. And again, I think it's just really, it's Wendy Williams, I love her. But I think she says you can't pick up black and put it down, and I think that's really true. But anyway, again, I always think about Saartjie Baartman, the Venus Hottentot, because she was also a character that was engaged in a performance, and there was a whole woman behind her, yet all we know is this body part that was encapsulated and ultimately put on display. So that's it. I want to take a picture of you guys. Oh, no, my phone got it. All right, thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Please come back Friday night for Annika Yeet, 6:30.
Stay high.